Welcome to part 2 of this review of our planned and prepared planet, our very home from home. In part 1 of this review, we drew attention to the planning, preparation and provision that took place both before and at the beginning of the formation of our planet, which involved 1. The positioning of the Earth in space, rotating on its inclined axis and in its orbit around the Sun. 2. The provision of air, water, land on the planet, and in space, a sun providing essential heat and light, together with cyclical seasons, a moon reflecting night light from the sun and acting as a tidal generator of the oceans, and also the many other planets and stars. 3. Here on the Earth, the provision of the laws of nature, the physical constants, the protective ozone layer, and magnetic field around the Earth, and gravity. 4. The provision of interdependency between species for food and assistance. In summary, everything that was provided was just right for the coming life of humans, animals, and plants. This indicates foreknowledge of what would be required for life on this unique planet. But as we think about these matters, we need some answers to our questions. Where did our unique planet and its vast, complicated life come from? Who or what caused them to be here? There are two distinct opposing worldviews. 1. Creation, planned, prepared, designed, and provided by an intelligent creator. 2. Macroevolution, mindless, unplanned, unprepared, undesigned, unguided, unintelligent, naturalistic, a random chance material process. In this part 2, we are looking at the theory of macroevolution, or TOE, TOE for short. We began with Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, which was published in a series of 6 editions from 1859 to 1876, because each of the first 5 volumes were criticized and Darwin had to revise his theory. Darwin's popularized trip to the Galapagos Islands has become part of folklore. While exploring the various islands, he noted small changes in the turtles and finches on each island. He then extrapolated his observations from change within a species, which is termed microevolution, to change from one species into another, which is termed macroevolution. On Darwin's return to the UK, he continued to note the effects of artificial selective breeding, with domestic pigeons in particular, and thought that probably the same thing could occur naturally. But in his reasoning, he didn't take into account the large input of the intelligence of the breeders, which is obviously not available in the natural world. So on both accounts, his reasoning was invalid. Now then, have you ever read what Mr. Darwin said? Let's look at Darwin's views in Darwin's words in Darwin's book Origin of Species. We start with the introduction. On page 3, he says, "Furthermore, I am convinced that natural selection has been the main, but not the exclusive means of modification." Page 7. "The laws governing inheritance are quite unknown. No one can say why the same peculiarity in different individuals of the same species and in individuals of different species is sometimes inherited and sometimes not so." A comment would be, he either didn't know or didn't bother to know the work of Mendel and his pea plant experiments. And then on page 33, he says, "But natural selection, as we shall see hereafter, is a power incessantly ready for action." Page 43. "This preservation of favourable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection." Page 51. "I am well aware that this doctrine of natural selection, exemplified in the above imaginary instances, is open to the same objections which were at first urged against Sir Charles Lyell's noble views on the modern changes of the earth. We move now to chapter 6, which he entitles Difficulties and Objections. He says on page 92, these difficulties and objections may be classed under the following heads. Firstly, why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine graduations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all nature in confusion instead of the species being, as we see them, well defined? Secondly, can we believe that natural selection could produce, on the one hand, organs of trifling importance, such as the tail of a giraffe, which serves as a fly flapper, and, on the other hand, organs of such wonderful structure as the eye, of which we hardly as yet fully understand the inimitable perfection? Our comment: a hospital consultant recently admitted that medics still don't know fully how the eye functions. And a Financial Times headline: science still battles to understand the human eye. Neurologists scratch their heads on how we convert the data deluge from our eyes. Back to Darwin. Thirdly, can instincts be acquired and modified through natural selection? What shall we say to so marvellous an instinct as that which leads the bee to make cells, which have practically anticipated the discoveries of profound mathematicians? Fourthly, how can we account for species, when crossed, being sterile and producing sterile offspring, whereas when varieties are crossed, their fertility is unimpaired? Page 92. But as by this theory innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Page 100. To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Page 101. It is scarcely possible to avoid comparing the eye to a telescope. We know that this instrument has been perfected by the long-continued efforts of the highest human intellects, and we naturally infer that the eye has been formed by a somewhat analogous process. But may not this inference be presumptuous? Have we any right to assume that the Creator works by intellectual powers like those of man? Our comment would be, why not? Because he made us in his image. Page 101. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can find out no such case. Our comment would be, well, his search was inadequate. For example, what about the very, very complicated eye already mentioned? Turn now to letters of Charles Darwin, Volume 2, 1887, from his house in Down, April 1860. I remember well the time when the thought of the eye made me cold all over, but I have got over this stage of the complaint, and now small trifling particulars of structure often make me very uncomfortable. A comment: according to Darwin, all the features of the eye could not have come into existence at one step. However, the animal human eye is functional only in a fully formed condition, as it is irreducibly complex. So according to Darwin, men and creatures had to wander around, perhaps for millions of years, bumping into trees, etc., because they were blind, waiting for their eyes to be fully constructed. Page 108. We have in this chapter discussed some of the difficulties and objections which may be urged against my theory. Many of them are very grave, but I think that in the discussion light has been thrown on several facts which on the theory of independent acts of creation are utterly obscure. Chapter 7, page 119. He must be a dull man who can examine the exquisite structure of a honeycomb, so beautifully adapted to its end, without enthusiastic admiration. We hear from mathematicians that bees have practically solved a recondite problem, and have made their cells of the proper shape to hold the greatest possible amount of honey, with the least possible consumption of precious wax in their construction. It has been remarked that a skilful workman, with fitting tools and measures, would find it very difficult to make cells of wax of the true form, though this is perfectly effected by a crowd of bees working in a dark hive. Grant whatever instincts you please, and it seems at first quite inconceivable how they can make all the necessary angles and planes, or even perceive when they are correctly made. Page 121. I believe that the hive bee has acquired, through natural selection, her inimitable architectural powers. Our comment: but it would take a skillful, intelligent craftsman many hours to construct such a hive. We arrive now at chapter 9, page 149. But just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties, which have formerly existed on the earth, be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Page 153. Now turn to our richest geological museums, and what a paltry display we behold. We note it's the same today. Again on page 153, that our paleontological collections are very imperfect is admitted by everyone. Page 160. The abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appear in certain formations has been urged by several paleontologists, none more forcibly than by Professor Sedgwick, as a fatal objection to the belief in the transmutation of species. If numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection. Note: we should check the fossil record in the Cambrian explosion, as he now suggests. Page 163. There is another and allied difficulty which is much graver. I allude to the manner in which numbers of species of the same group suddenly appear in the lowest known fossilized rocks. Page 163. To the question why we do not find records of these vast primordial periods, I can give no satisfactory answer. Darwin goes on to say, but the chief cause of our natural unwillingness to admit that one species has given birth to another and distinct species is that we are always slow in admitting great changes of which we do not see the steps. Our note is, perhaps, Charles, you don't see what doesn't exist. Chapter 10, page 181. He who rejects these views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. Chapter 14, page 243. That many and grave objections may be advanced against the theory of descent with modification through natural selection, I do not deny. Page 253. The framework of bones being the same in the hand of a man, wing of a bat, fin of the porpoise, and leg of the horse, etc., at once explain themselves on the theory of descent with slow and slight successive modifications. But we ask, why not created by the same intelligent designer, as with the beehive? Page 245. Why does not every collection of fossil remains afford plain evidence of the gradation and mutation of the forms of life? We meet with no such evidence. and this is the most obvious and forcible of the many objections which may be urged against my theory. Page 254. Anyone whose disposition leads him to attach more weight to unexplained difficulties than to the explanation of a certain number of facts will certainly reject my theory. Page 255. I believe that animals have descended from at most only 4 or 5 progenitors, and plants from an equal or lesser number. Analogy would lead me one step further, namely, to the belief that all animals and plants have descended from some one prototype, but analogy may be a deceitful guide. Page 256. Therefore, I should infer from analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form into which life was first breathed. Page 257. The noble science of geology loses glory from the extreme imperfection of the record. The crust of the earth with its embedded remains must not be looked at as a well-filled museum, but as a poor collection made at hazard and at rare intervals. Darwin, in 1866, said, "We are too apt to assume, without proof, that the geological record is so perfect that it would have afforded us plain evidence of the mutation of species, if they had undergone mutation. Flowers appeared and diversified relatively suddenly in the fossil record, creating what Charles Darwin described as the abominable mystery." Darwin's note to the 4th edition: "The great majority of naturalists believe that species are immutable productions and have been separately created. This view has been ably maintained by many authors." Letters of Charles Darwin, 1887, from his home in Down, April 1860. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Darwin should feel pain, because the peacock feathers demonstrate the truth of irreducible complexity, as the feathers cannot and do not evolve. For further information, see Stuart Burgess's book, Hallmarks of Design, from Day One Publications, for a description of the intricate details of the peacock feathers and how they interlock. Darwin says in his Origin Summary, number 1, "It is so easy to hide our ignorance under such expressions as the plan of creation, unity of design, etc., and to think that we give an explanation when we only restate a fact." Our response would be, "But it has to be said, Charles, that you did the same thing, and it can be said of your theory. It is so easy to hide your ignorance under such expressions as natural selection and on the theory of descent with slow and slight successive modifications, and to think that you give an explanation when you only restate alleged facts, that species have changed and are still slowly changing by the preservation and accumulation of successive slight favourable variations." A response: "But Charles, not from one species into another." Number 3, he says, "Why, it may be asked, have all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists rejected this view of the mutability of species?" And the answer is, because, Charles, their assessment and opinion was based upon scientific evidence and not based on supposition, conjecture, and possibilities, as you did. Darwin also wrote, "This address was delivered after the papers by Mr. Wallace and myself on the origin of species, presently to be referred to, had been read before the Linnean Society. As far as the mere enunciation of the principle of natural selection is concerned, it is quite immaterial whether or not Professor Owen preceded me, for both of us, as shown in this historical sketch, were long ago preceded by Dr. Wells and Mr. Matthews. And for our information, Dr. William Wells was a Scots-American, and he studied the evolution of skin colour in humans, and predicted that evolution could be applied more widely. Patrick Matthews was a Scots grain merchant and fruit farmer, who described natural selection in a treatise on timber production in 1831. We have heard what Darwin said in Darwin's words, and have noted the many problems and objections that Darwin referred to in his theory, which he did not solve. Are you surprised or even shocked at the number of problems with his theory? Darwin set out these objections in the knowledge that he would be criticized in the same way that another author had in a prior similar work called Vestiges. Darwin was therefore preparing and deflecting the forthcoming criticism. These problems were also referred to by many others in his day, and we will refer to those later. Despite the objections, Darwin went ahead promoting the theory and did so in the hope that the objections would disappear, but they didn't. He proceeded with the influential support of Dr. Joseph Hooker, who was his friend, T.H. Huxley and the X Club, which had been formed under the leading of Huxley to promote secular scientific evolution. The title of Darwin's book is also misleading because in his plan he stated that God had provided the first few forms of life from which natural selection could operate to produce all the forms of life in his day. Therefore, it wasn't actually origin of species, but development of species that Darwin should have described.